I'm not supposed to be here, but I found a gap in the hedge, and I couldn't resist this again for sunlight, because in there it's all, that's harrow wheels common in there. It's all shady. Look at this. Some farmer's field. I was thinking about groupoids. That stuff would make much more sense. I found it really confusing learning abstract algebra from starting with, say, a field, which is really complicated because it's got two operators and then all these conditions on each of them, and then conditions on both of them, like distributivity, and then you don't know, wow, what's the difference between a ring and a field? I remember starting with groups, but semi-groups. Semi-groups were pretty interesting because they like those substitution problems. Words, I can't remember what is it that a semi-group doesn't have? Inverses. But if you start at the top with groupoids, they're like you can sort of feel like you can understand the whole thing because they're so simple. You just have a set and you define a way of combining elements, and then syntactically you can characterize them. And they're the Catalan numbers. That's where the Catalan numbers come from. And then you impose more conditions on them, and you get, from groupoids you get to semi-groups and groups, and then rings, and then fields. And it'd be really interesting to know if in magma there's some way of defining these things as abstract data types. And having the type inference work at that level. And I was thinking about that thing that I did when I was in Bolivia in 2010 that I lost. That so totally traumatized me. And I know that what I started with was that construction that I wrote down in two pages. That's construction where you take ordinals and you index grammars with these ordinals, and that gives you this stratified hierarchy. I started with that, and the idea of simply interpreting languages, of producing the least, it was kind of producing a congruence. But from the top down, it was producing the least I started with some sort of notion of elements and then pairs of elements, and I used those to combine to produce functions, and functions were explicit graphs. Functions were always, in the set theory sense, they were graphs. And the operations, the elements that functions acted on were themselves functions, but functions in the lower. And that's what I did, and I just formalized these things with representations using a kind of lambda notation. And then very quickly, after kind of 3 iterations, I ended up with a kind of algebra which was a bit like a post machine, which did substitution, but it was slightly more general in that there was a kind of normalization process before the substitution, something like that. And it kind of closed off, and it was beautiful. And I swear I wrote down all the steps in the document, but when I got back to my computer, I couldn't find it. But I hadn't thought about types at that point, so it was only when all that fell to pieces and fell on the floor, and I got sick, I got thrombosis, and I ended up, I thought, well, okay, just go back to known stuff. And I thought, type inference, let's go back and do type inference and make sure you understand type inference. So I did that Hindley-Milner tutorial. But I'm still too afraid to go back and start looking at that stuff that I did in January, February of 2010, because it was so awful losing it. Isn't that pretty?